Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Ali Nouri. I'm a lecturer here in SPIA, and it is my great honor to introduce David Crane as our Bradford seminar speaker this week. David is no stranger to Princeton. In fact, he did his undergraduate major in the policy school. And then he went on and did his JD at Harvard, so it was a slight step down. But we're very happy to have David back. By the way, David, you're dressed very formally for an academic environment. Are you still working in the federal government?
No, man, I'm unemployed, so job interview after this.
Okay, so, all right. Well, David is really a unique person in that he's held transformative roles both in industry as well as in the public sector, and really spent his career at the crossroads of deploying large amounts of capital as it relates to energy. I'm not going to go through all the various boards and companies that he has led. There are many, both domestic and internationally focused. But I'll just mention a couple of things that he has done. One, he spent 12 years as the CEO of NRG. This is a multi-billion-dollar energy generation company with assets all over the country. David took this company from bankruptcy, made it into a Fortune 200 company. And as he did that, he expanded utility, renewable energy generation. He really took on a new role for the company as it related to distributed energy. And really was recognized as the energy industry CEO of the year for a lot of those efforts. And so it's no surprise that President Biden nominated David as the first energy infrastructure undersecretary for the Department of Energy when he assumed office. One of the hats that I wore when I was at the Energy Department was to help get our nominees confirmed. And I just remember Secretary Granholm, the Secretary of Energy, constantly asking me, when are we going to get David Crane confirmed? Because she understood that his role was going to really be the tip of the spear on the new industrial policy and energy transformation for the Energy Department. Of course, David did get confirmed. He served as the first ever undersecretary in that role, where he was in charge of an entirely new division to oversee the department's and really the country's energy transition by strategically deploying historical levels of energy capital across the country. So, David, it's really an honor to be with you, and really looking forward to having this conversation with you today.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, David, maybe we can just start with that last point, because when you came into the Energy Department, it was really at this pivotal moment. During the Biden administration, the climate conversation, which had been previously really been framed as a regulatory conversation to regulate fossil fuel in particular, had shifted to more of a conversation around industrial policy, manufacturing, clean energy deployment. And so a central part of that was really to rework the Department of Energy into this new industrial manufacturing and energy deployment powerhouse that you were central to. So we'd just love for you to walk us through that transformation, the key policies and the investments that drove this shift.
Well, okay. Is this on? Can you hear me? Yes. Well, first of all, it's great to be back here, not just at Princeton, but SPIA. So it's a broad topic, but if you think of infrastructure, and I always think of the clean energy transition. There's nature-based solutions. There's a lot to solving for climate, but energy is the single biggest part of it, right? It's, as I like to say, it's 70% of the problem and potentially 100% of the solution. But so historically in the United States at least, infrastructure, if you put infrastructure into energy, water, and transportation, energy is the most private sector led. So you can get with government action, public policy, you're more like providing the framework for it. Historically, for reasons that I don't really understand, and I go way back, the United States never liked to talk about industrial policy. Neither parties, I think, for different reasons, like to talk about industrial policy. But the Biden White House, led by Brian Deese, who's head Council of Economic Advisors, wrote some very influential papers about this, which probably everyone in the room, if you haven't read them, should. That set that stage. Then two pieces of legislation. You might say three with the CHIPS Act, but there were originally supposed to be four pieces of legislation: the CHIPS Act, a permitting bill that never got done, the Inflation Reduction Act, and what we called, for obvious reasons, the bipartisan infrastructure law, because it got like 3 Republican votes. But other people, I think, refer to it as the IIJ something or other. We called it bipartisan infrastructure law because we were so grateful for those 3 votes. So anyway, so historic amounts of money, like you said, in my area, $100 billion of grant money and $350 billion of loan authority. The grant money, and this was new for the United States, not new for Europe, was all set up as public-private partnerships, where the private sector would have to put in at least 50% of the money, and then the government would do the rest. And so that was the framework that I was recruited into. In fact, I did not seek a job in government. I was very happy doing what I was doing, but the secretary's chief of staff called up and said that all this had happened, and they were reorganizing, they had this new undersecretary, they wanted a private sector person to do it, and he asked me if I'd be interested. I said, well, if you hadn't passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, this would be a very short conversation. But with that $100 billion, I thought we could really take huge steps forward on the clean energy transition as the proper catalyst to move things forward with the new technologies that are necessary to get us from where solar and wind has brought us to the next level.
And as part of that, David, can you talk a little bit about the manufacturing office, the MESC office, because this was a new office, and to your earlier point, it was really central to what the Department of Energy was doing on the industrial policy side of things. So can you just talk a little bit about that office, why it was created, and what some of its activities were?
Yeah. So, one thing, and Secretary Granholm would, really, listening to her speak when I first got there, and maybe you wrote this, was she always emphasized the national security aspects of energy. No talk about saving polar bears or anything. It's about national security. And from where I sat, and when I was in this school, and I hate to say it, but in the 1970s, the defining moments were the 2 oil shocks, right? And as a private sector person, for the 40 to 50 years since then, I love to sort of say we allowed OPEC to bring this country to its knees in the 1970s, and for 40 or 50 years we've never really done anything to change the fundamentals of America's dependence on foreign sources of oil. And now we have the clean energy transition, and the way we always frame it is, are we going to substitute 50 years of dependence on Middle Eastern oil for as part of this new transition for dependence on Chinese manufacture? And so the people that designed the bill did something which, was groundbreaking. They created a manufacturing and supply chain aspect. And I have an office that was called that, the Manufacturing Supply Chain Office. They had $15 billion of grant money And they existed intentionally to look at the value chains, and we were looking at ultimately in two ways. What have we already lost? Well, we lost the battle to make solar panels, and we're very close to finally losing the battle to make batteries. How do we reverse that? And then for parts of the new technology, and what I would call the big three were, electrolyzers for hydrogen, transmission equipment, which actually is not made in China, it's more made in Europe. And then equipment for the new wave of nuclear plants. Make sure that that was all manufactured in the United States. And so that's a big part of what those bills to make. Also, we were given money to convert manufacturing facilities from making internal combustion engines to making electric engines. And so it's a very thoughtful piece of legislation.
And to that point, I saw in your final letter to your employees, you hit on a few of those successes after your 3 years at DOE. These were statistics like having expanded or initiated more than 900 manufacturing facilities, $200 billion in clean energy investments announced, over 200,000 projected new jobs. And as you said, many of these are investments in solar, batteries, hydrogen, other technologies, things that are at the heart of this US-China competition. And now we have, of course, a administration that is taking a very different approach to this very idea. By slowing federal support to these technologies, by pausing investments in, say, clean energy, pausing permitting for wind energy, pushing more on the fossil fuel side of things. So I'm wondering what happens to this momentum? Does this capital flow that you have been working on, does this get redirected elsewhere? Do companies hedge their bets and shift their production overseas? And just generally, what happens to this clean energy manufacturing renaissance that we have been experiencing?
Well, I mean, manufacturing works its way back from end-use demand, right? And so the earlier stages of manufacturing to make something that's, if you were going to locate the United States to make parts of offshore wind turbines, and now it appears that that's not going to happen. You're not going to go forward with the manufacturing. And one of the things that's probably unfortunate, I mean, when you said we had that statistic, 900 factories announced, but whether they go forward or not, the business people are going to make the rational economic decision. Just a couple things. Obviously, a change of administration and lots of announcements, almost ones that all universally look negative from where we sit. I mean, I'd start by saying that all of us who were in the Biden energy department genuinely wanted the Trump 2 energy department to succeed, to carry on. They were obviously going to change some things, some tones of things. The initial wave of announcements is it's pretty dire, but is it meant for shock and awe, or is it meant for real outcomes? We didn't mean to do this. It's funny because the government tracks everything, but one thing we didn't track when we gave awards, but the Wall Street Journal did it for us, was how many of our projects were in Republican states versus Democratic states. I will say to everyone in the room, as we pick projects, and if we considered the geography of the projects, it was for some legitimate business purpose, like, oh, how are they going to get this product out? It wasn't Republican. And as a result, the Republican states won something like 70% of the money, and the Republican states tend to have Republican senators who, so, I mean, I think a lot of the projects will end up going forward, based on this is a government very much based on what President Trump himself wants to do. He doesn't like offshore wind because he doesn't like the offshore wind turbines next to his golf course in Scotland. I don't know why he doesn't like electric vehicles, but he doesn't. Those things are on, the more dangerous end. Nuclear, advanced geothermal is on the safer end. No one seems to know how he feels about hydrogen. But one thing I would caution everyone about, and we talked about this earlier, at the end of the day, energy is about price. And more coal-fired power plants were shut down in Trump 1 than were shut down during the Obama years. And that's because coal couldn't compete, mainly against natural gas at the time. And so you'll hear some things, and I think the place where it's going to be most obvious, and you shouldn't, you can despair if you think it's happening because of public policy, but it's happening because of economics, is green hydrogen. Green hydrogen in the United States was premised on the idea of virtually free wholesale electricity from wind and solar as that penetrated the market. When the data center, when the hyperscalers came along and said, look, we're going to absorb every last electron of clean energy in this country, then the premise of a bunch of very cheap green electrons going into making hydrogen so they could be used, that fundamental economic principle has stopped. So I would sense that whether they say it out loud or not, I think most companies right now are going to just go quiet. They're not really going to change their strategy for political reasons, because electric companies don't plan in 4-year cycles. But you will, I think, see serious retrenchment on the hydrogen side. Green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, not. But that's probably more about economics than about President Trump.
And David, if we do see that sort of retrenchment, who picks up the slack? Is this one of these cases where the U.S. uncertainty just reinforces China's position as the go-to partner for the energy transition for other countries, or are we going to see emerging economies like India, Brazil, Indonesia making their own bets and their own advances on clean energy?
Well, one thing's for better or for, in this case, worse, that happens is you just see the power of American leadership. I think that after years of being on the sideline, globally, the great advantage of the bipartisan infrastructure law followed by the Inflation Reduction Act was it reasserted American leadership at the front of the pack on climate change. There was a lot after IRA passed, Europeans complaining about, you're too generous with this. Now all these European companies are going to build these things in the U.S. rather than Europe. And Senator Manchin would say stuff like this. He'd be like, tough, and I'd say as a climate person, it is global warming. It's a global effort, but would you rather have the United States lead from the front or lead from the rear? And it's tough for the rest of the world because we go from leading from the front to leading from the rear. But at least for 4 years there, we were leading from the front, and it affected other people's behavior. I don't know there are people in the room, I should say this, energy is obviously global. These two pieces of legislation that I was responsible for implementing were very overtly domestic pieces of legislation. They had to be domestic to get passed through. So for my 3 years, I was going to places like Poughkeepsie. I wasn't going to, Peking. I was trying to be illiterate there, but alliteration, Beijing. But so I don't know. I would defer to the international people on whether the other countries, they'll say, look at the new U.S. retrenchment and say, okay, we'll pick up the slack. I will say that I think the people who will pick up the slack are the democratic states, and for everyone in the room that's despairing, I've heard this directly, person to person. I'm sure he says it publicly. You talk to Governor Newsom, you talk to David Hochschild, who runs the California Energy Commission, and they're going to lean in. California is the 5th largest economy on the planet, and we will step up. If California steps up, if Michigan steps up, if New York steps up, and there's history to this. If you go back, probably when some of you were very, very young, but when there were first things like renewable portfolio standards, like 25 years ago, when Bill Clinton gave way to Bush 43, and Bush 43, particularly his first term, was a climate denier, got a little better over his 8 years, but when he pulled back from the momentum that Clinton-Gore had just started, the Democratic states actually stepped up. They passed state-level renewable portfolio standards, and I think reflexively, when an Obama comes in or a Biden comes in, the Democratic states take their foot off the pedal and say, the feds have this now. And so it's not a perfect substitute for having the United States government with all that it entails, being leaders, but these states can accomplish a lot, and they certainly can keep the pilot lights, burning. They can keep innovation burning. And the one other thing we mentioned is, one of the things we always struggle with at the federal government is if you tried to boil a clean energy standard down to, electrify everything while making the electric industry zero carbon, that's sort of a climate change strategy for energy right there. In the United States, electricity regulation is fundamentally done at the state level. And one of the things that we struggle with, one of the technologies we were trying to get up was long duration energy storage. And one of the issues we had was, well, the utilities are the market for this. They can't get, 10 plus hour storage into rate base because the public service commissions in their states are, for whatever reasons, too conservative. Second term, we're going to have to really work with the public. We're going to have to go state by state and get them to let the utilities do this stuff after we demonstrate it. So in some ways, the states are actually, if it's going to be a clean electricity all the time as opposed to just clean energy, the states are actually in a very good position to lead on this.
So let me just hone in on that point a little more, David, on your point on the power sector. Because what we were seeing prior to Bill and IRA go into effect was that power sector emissions in the US were going down because of things that you were doing at NRG and what other utilities were doing. And through renewable energy deployment, energy efficiency, the shift from coal to gas, and IRA and Bill, of course, were intended to make that transition more quickly even. Now we're in a position where those bills are under threat, those policies are under threat, and at the same time, there's going to be new demands on the grid. You talked about AI and data centers. We have more manufacturing facilities that are energy hungry, and we have plenty of more electrification, whether it's in the transportation sector or in our homes and buildings. And this is all happening at a time where the administration, the incoming administration, is less interested in pursuing clean energy options and more interested in pursuing fossil. So going forward, do you see this continuing decline of emissions that we have been seeing in the power sector? Are you optimistic about that? Or do you see a different trend?
The short answer is that I certainly think that the carbon intensity from the electricity sector is going to continue on the same trajectory. But this AI-driven data center, and I'd like to address that a little bit more broadly, because my view is that everything that happens in the electricity sector over the next 2 to 3 years is going to be decided by the hyperscalers. And And you know, when you talk to these folks that are talking about AI-driven data centers, and there's a big communication gap. Like Silicon Valley people talk about everything with unbridled optimism, while energy people tend to be glass half empty people because, yeah, something goes, I mean, most people don't pay attention to energy until something goes seriously wrong. So if you've spent your whole life in a career where no one pays attention to you until Superstorm Sandy comes up and suddenly, you know, it's getting cold in New Jersey and people are still without their lights in the third week, you know, and so you've got these two industries that don't really talk to each other in the way. But I mean, I go out, I talk to the AI-driven, the data center people. I say, well, how much electricity do you need? Infinite. And I'm like, okay, you know, if I really listened to you guys back in 2017, by 2025, you know, we'd all be, there'd be no one driving a car, right? Like, you know, it'd be all automated cars. Like, you guys do get a little bit ahead of yourself, you know, sometimes. You know, and then you say, well, okay, where are you going to need this infinite electricity? We can't tell you. You know, and I'm like, well, you know, you want transmission lines. So, okay, we'll tell you, Pacific Northwest. And I'm like, no, I don't need a box that's 1,500 miles in every direction. I need within like 3 miles. Like, anyway, so the big question for climate folks as they look at, I mean, the good thing about the hyperscalers as they sit here today is that, you know, they all have very serious commitments to go zero carbon over time. At the same time, I don't think it's been lost on anyone in the room, the effort of those very same companies to, at the highest level, to reach an accommodation with the Trump administration, you know, to be very visibly supportive. And so the question is, does their commitment to go zero carbon erode? And the flashpoint is going to be gas-fired combined cycle plants. Between you and me, I always thought it was unrealistic when we sat around the Department of Energy and thought, oh, they're going to build all these things and there's not going to be a whit of fossil fuel. You know, but do they do gas-fired combined cycle with carbon capture on it, or do they just say it'll be carbon capture ready, which is basically saying nothing? You know, and because we have carbon capture. You want to put carbon capture on the back of a gas-fired power plant, you can do that. You know, so in many ways, if I think that the bellwether for this is to watch the AI-driven data center companies and see how much they stick to the commitments that they've made as they enter this space race on data centers. And just to give you one sense of how crazy this is, there probably aren't a lot of corporate geeks in the room like me, but if you, in the world of M&A in corporate America, if you buy a company that's more than 5% of your own market cap, 5%, so 1/20th your size, you have to file an 8K with the SEC. The 5 hyperscalers, any one of them, could buy the largest electricity company in the United States, which is NextEra, and not file an 8K. That's how irrelevant the size of the energy sector is compared to the. So when you have 5 $3 trillion market caps sitting there, I mean, their power to decide this future is in their hands.
That's a really interesting point, and it's also very interesting to see how their commitments are very different as it relates to their net zero goals, because they're largely voluntary corporate commitments, and so it's really important to hold their feet to the fire of making sure they live up to their own commitments, and making sure that they're verifiable and they have high fidelity. David, let me just ask you a couple more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. I want your advice for students, because over the past 4 years, we of course had a surge of interest and talent going into the federal government. People were really interested in joining the Climate Corps, various Department of Energy programs, federal initiatives. I remember going to work every day and listening to our leader at the Department of Energy, Secretary Granholm, say we have this many days left and our mission to reduce emissions by this much. And it was just wonderful to have such a mission-oriented job every morning, getting me out of bed. Today, we have a very different mission in the administration, and quite frankly, it's one that doesn't quite align with the interests of students that are interested in pursuing climate change and clean energy. So I guess my question to you is, what is your advice to them, and what's your advice on how they can continue to make an impact in this new challenging environment?
Yeah, so let me just say, I mean, again, I didn't really contemplate public service really at any point in my life. I mean, well, I'm so old. I once contemplated public service in the United States Army in Vietnam, but as you know, once I got into private sector, being in the energy industry, and to go in public service at age 64 is probably different from the way you all are thinking about it. But I would say that for me, having had success in the private sector, going in public service, didn't know whether I was going to like it. You hear a lot of things, oh, don't do it, very frustrating. It was just the most amazing experience of my life and the greatest honor. But two things that you said in there are important for you all, no matter what type of job you're considering. Number one, purpose-driven. I mean, I was running sort of a startup part of the Department of Energy, going from 0 to 1,800 people, a lot of internal transfer, but people who wanted to go for the purpose of, and there's just, NRG, when I ran it, that was purpose-driven. Not every company, not every institution, but man, like you just said, that's the thing. What gets me out of bed in the morning is to go to purpose. And the second thing you mentioned is inspirational leadership. I had the good fortune before I went into government, because I've been running these companies and stuff, that it was the last time I had a boss that was in the same building as me was in the previous millennium. And I didn't know what it was going to be like having a boss, down the hallway. And I say in the building because even when you're CEO, boards of directors, everyone has bosses. But I mean, the leader we had in Jennifer Granholm, I had known her a little bit before she was Secretary of Energy, former governor of Michigan and all that. But just the fact that one person could impose their personality, their values, the fact that I would guess maybe you work for other government agencies, but this was the end of career thing for her. All of us, I don't know a person that worked at the Department of Energy who didn't think that Jennifer Granholm should be President of the United States, but there was the little fact that she's born in Canada. And we sit next to transportation where Pete Buttigieg is, and Secretary Buttigieg is good Secretary of Transportation, but everyone knows he's got something else in mind. But for Jennifer Granholm, final port of call, right? And I don't know. So the two things I'd say is go someplace that could be purpose-driven and look at the person at the top of the organization, because even if you're 6 layers down, you're going to feel the personality of the person at the top if they're any kind of leader. And so what was the rest of the question? So
you answered it. That was very profound, David.
Well, I'd say, and I mentioned, just be a little bit creative. I mean, don't give up the hope of federal government service, but I don't imagine there's anyone in the room that's thinking about applying to the federal government right now. But there's states, there's other countries that, many institutions that you can hone your skills in over the years.
David, you mentioned Secretary Granholm's leadership qualities. I've learned a lot also just by watching you as a leader. And one of the unique things that you did at the end of your term at the Department of Energy was you sent this letter to all of your staff noting their accomplishments. And I encourage everybody to read this letter. It's David Crane's letter to DOE. And I'm just gonna read a couple sentences from the letter where you say, "Finally, I wanted to thank you all for demonstrating to me the power of purpose. For 3 years, we labored together in the hyper-partisan Washington bubble, a legion of DOE career civil servants, with the full range of personal political views amongst you, smattered with an overlay of political appointees chosen by Democratic administration. And for years, I couldn't tell the difference." And I think that is so profound in the context of what is happening today with the assault that we are seeing on the career service employees in Washington. So thank you, David, for everything you did to transform the department, everything you did for the energy transformation, and for your leadership. So with that, I want to open this to questions from the audience. Let's start right here.
Hey, David. You had mentioned just at the beginning about permitting and that bill that didn't pass. I'd love to hear more about permitting because, I mean, especially what you said about green hydrogen being slower to come, or the molecules aren't going to see green hydrogen as fuels, etc. Blue hydrogen is going to be really important. And in order for blue hydrogen to take off, you need carbon capture. And when I was in Houston talking to stakeholders maybe a year and change ago, repeatedly what the partners are saying is that we can't do carbon capture because these class 6 wells aren't being permitted. The permits take 25 months, but it's longer than 25 months, and there are 70 plus projects that are waiting for permitting. I mean, how do we accelerate permitting so that things can move faster?
Yeah, do I need to, there's a.
If you could quickly repeat the question,
Yeah.
that'd be great.
So the question is about permitting reform, and again, what I would say about during the Biden administration and just more generally is that, compared to what's there now, we look like a bunch of lefties, of course, but I personally come from what I call the pragmatic wing of the Democratic Party. We had a far left wing to contend with, and what's frustrated permitting reform on the Democratic side is that there's been suspicion about it from the NGOs that permitting reform would just make it too easy to do fossil fuel thing. But certainly once we started to do these hundreds of projects with hundreds of billions, that the sclerosis in the permitting of federal, state, and local was hurting green projects a lot more. Now you mentioned class 6 wells for carbon sequestration. That's a big part of it. One would hope that this is an area where if this administration was right of center instead of far right, if they would do some things that were constructive once they get through shock and awe, that this is an area where there should be room for compromise, and because carbon capture is a key part of it, and so I hope to see it. I hope to see it happen. Ali actually knows much more about why it didn't happen in the last years, or I don't know, but we need it. So.
Hi, David. I'm going to just follow up on one thing you just said, and then I have a different question. So with respect to carbon capture, we know that in some ways Europe has already done the experiment in terms of trying to get to social acceptance. And what's happened is, any carbon capture that's going on is offshore. So I don't know about these wells that Lynn just talked about. So are those offshore or not? Because I think we may have that problem coming here. It's part of the issue with permitting, right? So that's one point. The second question is a more pragmatic one. Can you say something about your understanding as to how much the Trump administration could actually pull back of the dollars that were appropriated in IAJA and the IRA bills. It would be really nice to understand that.
Okay, so the question is, how much of the money can the Trump administration pull back? And there's a question of public acceptance. The carbon sequestration that we're talking about is not offshore. It's in the U.S. I mean, surprisingly, it wasn't very high on our concerns. I mean, it tends to be in remote parts of Texas in the West, and there was much more concerns, at least at this early stage, with the economics of it than, and we hit 2 big direct air capture projects, one on Kings Ranch in southern Texas, one in far west of Louisiana, and we were engaging with the community, but again, the bigger question wasn't, could we get people to agree to do it? It was more, this is going to cost $500 a ton.
Well, there's that, obviously, but it is also the case that, based on the work that I've been involved in through the National Academy, is sharing the study on carbon utilization. It's just clear that social acceptance is going to be a huge bottleneck.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't even know. I mean, the point is that most public don't understand and don't know about CCS, carbon capture and storage. So they don't know whether or not they would accept it or not. But the accident that happened just a couple of years ago that sent a bunch of people to the hospital because a pipeline ruptured doesn't help.
No, it doesn't. And it may be that we just hadn't gotten to that issue. And when I got to the department, and I played no part in influencing the writing of either of the 2 bills, but I mean, I had also thought, like you, that we were going to have to get to carbon to materialization because sequestration just wasn't popular, and it's always going to be a cost. But the tax credits really favored sequestration, and so someone had made the decision. So, but the fact that we could have gotten to that issue, but we still were going over the economics first and voluntary carbon credit markets. And on the other topic, how much can they? We were very focused, and we were actually focused on doing this even before Trump won the election. It's just at the end of 4 years, it's good to tie a bow around as many things as possible. And even if there had been another Democratic administration, people had told me, and I had seen, between Obama 1 and Obama 2, there's a certain number of turnover in people. So, the private sector doesn't like a 3 to 6 month hiatus when a lot of money's at stake. So we were always trying to get a lot done. I mean, Secretary Granholm with her Post-it note with number of days left, kept us focused. And then, of course, when Trump won, that really focused the mind. So at the end of the day, my part of the Department of Energy did $80 billion of grant money and $110 billion of loan. And then they came in, and I can't even remember which one, but there's a big difference in the government language between obligated and what's committed. And one is let's just call it obligated. Obligated means the full faith. I mean, it's a contractual obligation of the United States government. It's never been undone before. So we were trying to get as much obligated as possible. And then they froze all that, and said, we're not going to, even if it's obligated, we're not going to disperse it. And that was the thing. There was an order from OMB freezing, unfreezing, and I think it's still up in the air now. But if you believe that ultimately that should prevail, that something that represents the contractual obligation of the United States and the full faith and credit of the United States government, that money should be hard for them as a legal matter to stop. they've obviously, any money we didn't get obligated, they've canceled all that.
And can you say how much that was? That didn't get obligated,
Well,
roughly?
we obligate, on the grant side, we obligated roughly 80 billion of 100 billion, 80%, and most that we didn't obligate was because it was future fiscal year. And then on the, and I mean, I don't know what they did with the 200 and some billion of not utilized yet loan authority, but I'm pretty sure they're not going to do any more loans unless, it's, Mar-a-Lago or something. But, so not, I think a lot of that was for effect, and that, a lot of those projects will try and go forward. But, as a person that did projects and project finance for my whole life, I would just say, projects are hard. I mean, projects in scaling up 10x, 20x new clean energy technology, it's hard. You have to want to do it. And so just because we can say, okay, the courts are telling you you have to give them that money, the private sector partner who's putting in more than 50% of the partner are like, well, let me get this straight. I'm going to put in my 50% against this person here next to me who's subject to the whims of someone who could go off the rails on me because of something I said, about a DEI policy I had in a different country. I mean, it's not creating an environment that's conducive for public-private partnerships, to achieve goals that this administration doesn't have in the first place. So, so what might it come down to? Things that they do love. Apparently they're good with transmission, so that's great. We need more transmission. They love nuclear, but nuclear is its own beast, which they're going to find is difficult, and maybe geothermal, because it's oil and gas, it's drilling.
Related, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about something you mentioned earlier when you were talking about how these large private companies with data centers are not necessarily communicating with utilities in a way that ends up leading to a lot of information sharing and being able to plan for the future. Could you talk more about maybe how you think we can foster this communication and the different types of relationships they should be building?
Well, I mean, what I said was that with the data center companies when they're talking to us at the government, but what you said is also true when you talk to the data center companies, and they're like, hey man, and it always focuses on Northern Virginia, right? Because, I mean, you tell me, but why are 90% of the data centers in the universe have to be in Northern Virginia? I don't know. So it all comes down to everyone's talking to Dominion all the time. And they just say, well, Dominion, who, it's like they're the golden goose, right? They're sitting there, they're demanding that we take every risk, we pay for everything, and the data center companies are having trouble coming to grips with the fact that they need to become energy companies. Before AI-driven data centers come up, the only industry, I shouldn't say only, but the only industry that immediately comes to mind that is so dependent on energy that it's a fundamental part of what the industry is the aluminum industry, because aluminum refining is just so incredibly energy intensive. But now data is so energy intensive, and so these the hyperscalers don't want to become energy companies because they think of energy, particularly electricity, as the most boring, fungible commodity on the face of the earth, and it's not consistent with their sense of self. But they have to become it. But they're having growing pains. Look at the boards of directors of the 5 hyperscalers. You won't find any energy people on the board. So they originally thought that what they could do, which is what they successfully did for solar and wind, is they just provide offtake agreements and say, if you can provide me with zero carbon electricity in this spot in the year 2024, we'll buy it for this price, end of story. But now they know they need nuclear. Nuclear, you can't just sign an offtake agreement and believe that these entrepreneurial small nuclear companies are actually going to build a nuclear plant that's going to provide you there's no financing for it, so they have to get more involved, and the easy thing for them is to work with utilities, to buy up any merchant nuclear plant they can across the country, but they know that's very unpopular too, because they're basically taking zero carbon electrons from the rest of it. So I don't know that this is my long-winded way of saying I have no answer to your question. They just need to spend more time in the room with each other. We talked, again, in the department, we were going to try and broker more meetings with them to see if having the government in the room but the five are so fiercely in competition with each other, it's really hard to do something when they just won't tell you anything, they won't get down, they won't even tell you so tell me the load profile of your AI-driven data center during the day. I mean, would there ever be a time where you might be able to drop 500 megawatts back on the grid or something? No, we can't tell you. So, anyway.
Yeah, so I think you kind of already touched on it when you respond to Emily's question, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what do you see are the things that is happening now that will more likely to have a long-term enduring effect, even if we have a different administration 4 years from now? Is it because the policy uncertainty make it so hard for the company to plan? Is it like there might be a reduction in trust, make it harder to build a relationship, or is it like something else? So I'm curious to hear your thought about what are the things that will likely have a more longer term impact, even beyond 4 years.
Well, I mean, the best would be if they show their hand on what they want to be constructive of, and because there is overlap, like the things we talked about. We wanted to do geothermal, but it's more natural for Republicans. We wanted to do nuclear, but it comes more naturally for Republicans, right? I mean, like when we would go through the budget process, we'd intentionally not put any money in for nuclear because we would know the Republicans in the House would put it in on their own. So why should we shoot a bullet? And if they want to, do transmission, that's great too, because transmission helps everything. So the best would be if they, this is, I don't know. You guys follow this, but day one they announced a national energy emergency, which I don't know what that means, but if it draws attention to the fact that suddenly electricity demand in the United States is going to go up, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you use it to marshal the forces. And then of course they start doing everything they can to not help the solar industry and the wind industry, which fortunately, we weren't actually doing that much to help the solar and the wind industry because they're already the lowest cost form of electricity in the United States. But you're like, okay, you declare a national energy emergency, and the two forms of energy we have in this country that you can put online in 12 to 24 months, and it's zero carbon. And last year, 96% of the new electricity brought in the United States was zero carbon. And of course, the vast majority of that was solar or wind. You're like, okay, your ideology is getting in the way of doing pragmatic stuff, and energy is all about doing pragmatic things. So if they get through their shock and awe phase and then become sort of pragmatic, right of center people led by Chris Wright, he's a business guy, and they can work with moderate Democrats, you could see, okay, well, we're emphasizing slightly different things now, but it's all part of the mosaic. And if Democrats come back, then we can push harder on the stuff that they don't like so much, like electric vehicles. That's my hope.
Question right there?
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to ask from your perspective, straddling in private and public sectors. I'm just going to move because I can't see you. Okay. I wanted to ask your view on the, I guess, almost ideology that's being taken from Silicon Valley tech companies and being applied to the federal government. This idea of like efficiency in a very particular sense of slash and burn and then see what's resilient to that onslaught. I think that's something that's been applied a lot in the private sector, at least in one subsector of the tech industry. What's your take on, I don't know, just like what does that look like when applied to the federal government? Of course, we're seeing that live right now, but can something emerge from that, or how do we, if we object to that approach, what are some ways to be in conversation with that ideology?
Well, and so when you're talking about efficiency, you're talking institutional efficiency, you're not talking energy efficiency.
Yes,
Okay.
institutional.
No, you know,
Yeah.
it's interesting that you say that, because there's no doubt that, you know, that the federal government wastes money. Like any big institution wastes money, but, you know, I start with this administration, why are they doing this? Are they doing this to cut the crazy federal deficit, which, you know, President Trump first time added 7.8 trillion to? No, they're doing it to pay for the rich person tax cut that they're planning. And so, you know, one thing, and so that's the way a business person would look at it, is what's the opportunity cost? Like, you're gonna spend all this effort, you know, endangering the effectiveness of these organizations in order to save this amount of money so that you can give rich people a thing and increase the deficit, because this budget bill is like, oh, you have to have $1 cost savings for every $5 of tax cut or something. Like, who does that math? You know, but I mean, I joined I became CEO of two different companies, International Power and then NRG, where I actually started the exact same way. I said, like, okay, we have what we have here, but let's now whiteboard this. Like, if we just start with what we actually have to do with a blank piece, blank thing. And you see a little of this in what Musk announced last week. You know, every federal employee has to justify what they do, which is just, I mean, it's silly, because what are you gonna do? You know, you've got 2.5 million people writing personal essays about what they do. You know, who's gonna read them all? Yeah. But the idea that, you know, okay, well, let's go back to the first principles and sort of think through because, you know, I'm sure you probably know, I mean, I'm sure the energy department had parts of it that were left over from, you know, 1974, and just said, every institution, whether it's government or business or not-for-profit, it's amazing to me when you look at it. The first thing it does is try and perpetuate itself, you know, and so the idea that the government could use a significant refresh is not necessarily a bad idea. And, you know, when Clinton put Al Gore in charge of a government efficiency thing, and it leads to a 500-page report that gets sent to Congress where nothing happens with it, you know, they're taking a very different approach. But, I mean, you know, when they start with the Department of Energy by firing 500 specialists who are, you know, responsible for safeguarding the country's nuclear weapons, you know they're not going about it in any sort of thoughtful way. So I don't know. I'm sort of conflicted on your question, because there's some logic to it, but not the way it's being done from my perspective.
I think we have time for one last question, right here.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'll follow up closely on that one. Thank you so much for this time, it's been so informative. My question is for someone, you spoke briefly about sort of the people who are looking for jobs, potentially in the federal government or in other ways to make an impact on climate change and energy transition and that kind of thing. What should people in that position do for the next 4 years to buy time but still, like, or rather, what other sectors are worth sort of looking into and applying to? And is there any chance that some portion of the slack of the federal workforce will be picked up elsewhere in the private sector and other public sector areas, and where would you anticipate that taking place? Because a lot of people just lost their jobs, a lot of people aren't going to get access to jobs. Are they all just going to disappear and all be unemployed for 4 years, or are there like other places that should pick up the slack in employing people who are interested in this kind of thing?
Well, you know, it's interesting when they lose, they say, okay, I mean, the first people, I mean, there's 2,000 political appointees across the federal government, and, you know, and suddenly on November 6th, they find out, okay, well, you're definitely out on, you know, January 17th, you know, because that's when they, you know, technically noon on January 20th, but they take your electronics away on January 7th. So, you know, it's a big world out there, and there's lots. I mean, I guess what I would just say to everyone, and I was telling Ali earlier, is it's just don't compromise your principles. To me, far more distressing than anything that Trump himself is doing is because Trump is, who Trump is, and if nothing else, he's very transparent of what he's about. But when you see, two folks who I know personally and who were dedicated to climate for their whole life, Elon Musk and Bobby Kennedy, sort of throwing in with that thing, it has to make you sort of reevaluate, like, what do core values mean to me as an individual? And, for me, and I'm not trying to make myself a paragon of idealism, but getting fired from NRG in 2015 because, I refused to go away from the green thing, and then getting fired by the American people, in November. But I mean, I haven't lost a moment of sleep, the fact that I've stuck to what I believe in, and that's made my life, and I'm at the very end of my career, very enriching. And so it's easy for me because, CEO, made enough money, people have to put food on the table, roof over their heads, raise kids and stuff, but I'd say, like, just, believe in a couple things and just, and honor that, because if you're the type of person that I think the people in this room are, it will gnaw at you if you compromise that over time. And there are lots of institutions out there doing good things, not just the federal government. And just go where you have impact, go where you see the inspirational leadership that is going to help you develop and help you stay to your North Star. That would be all I can say.
David, thank you so much. David, thank you so much for your inspirational words, for your leadership. This was terrific. You mentioned earlier you're going on the job circuit, so we can't wait to find out where you land and all these amazing things you're going to accomplish. Thank you.
Thank you.